Was gaan aan, Tieve? My terrible Afrikaans aside, I want to talk about South Africa, but I'm going to have to be irreverent because otherwise I'm just going to cry. It is a horrible situation which people on lots of different sides are exploiting, and that's why I decided to look into it. I saw the right wing outside of South Africa exploiting the situation in South Africa to push their racist agenda, and I saw racists on the other side doing the same, black racists, black supremacists and so on, doing exactly the same thing. So I've tried really hard to cut through the bullshit, and there's a lot of bullshit going on, to try and get to the bottom of what is actually going on in South Africa. First, a little bit of context.
It's not bloody surprising, man, 'cause we're a bunch of arrogant bastards who hate black people.
South Africa's an old colonial nation on the south of Africa. It is, at least for the time being, or was, the second largest economy in Africa. It was settled by the Dutch, who became the Boers, and the British, in two waves of colonisation. And then that later, along with the locals and other immigrants, became South Africa. From 1948 until 1994, South Africa was under apartheid, and that was basically pre-civil rights American South on steroids, to give you some kind of point of reference. It was a genuine case of institutionalized racism, and even before 1948 it was implicit that this was how things were, that the whites were superior, that the whites controlled the land, had greater access to education, better rights, better facilities, everything was segregated, settlement was only allowed to whites in certain areas, and so on. It was a racist shithole. And for a very long time it was an absolute international pariah due to apartheid. I mean, there are a few causes that are absolutely morally certain, but the kind of institutionalized racism and the crackdowns and abuses of power that were going on in South Africa up until the 1990s, that's as clear-cut a case of the moral high ground as you can have to object to what was going on. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because obviously not everyone was on board with this, particularly as we progressed, through the 80s into the 90s. Lots of people, lots of whites, were very much against apartheid. And going back even further, this was the case. It tended to be more the English-descended settlers who were more liberal and more activist about removing apartheid, and it tended to be the Boers who wanted to keep things as they were. But that's an incredibly broad brush. Still, it's important to note that there are two separate and distinct white ethnic groups within South Africa, and there's also a significant proportion of Asians, particularly Indians, who were also treated as second-class citizens during apartheid, but perhaps second class rather than third class, which is how the blacks were treated. Now, in my youth, South Africa was this pariah state. We would make fun of South African accents on the playground because we'd watched Spitting Image. We'd never met a South African, we'd never met a black person, but there we were going, South Africa, kill it the blicks, Rhodesia, and yeah, making fun of them. They were the butt of the joke in a lot of comedies, political satire and so on, and they turned up as villains in films because of this moral certitude that what they were doing was wrong, and because by the 80s and 90s people had gotten a bit bored with Nazis as enemies and hadn't yet really progressed to making the English into everyone's enemy. So there you go. It's not as clear-cut or as simple as you think, because there were white activists who were against all this. Now, personal anecdote, to make this perhaps a little bit more relatable. In the late 80s, early 90s, I knew a few lads who were from South Africa, Afrikaners, who were from South Africa and were working around England. Some of them were staying in London, some of them had come over for education and so on. But they'd also come over in order to dodge the draft. Now, the white government conscripted young white men with no choice into either the military or the police force. And these lads were trying to escape from that. And I remember hugging this poor guy as he sobbed his guts out at the train station because he had to go back tomorrow to be conscripted into the police force, and he didn't want to hurt anybody, he didn't want to shoot any black people, he didn't want any of this, and he tried to get away from it and he couldn't. He had to go back. So it's not just a matter of black and white at all. You know, there's plenty of peaceful people who wanted to create a truly multicultural, you know, interracial country and wanted peace, prosperity, and everything for everyone.
Now he's never met a North African, and that's not bloody surprising, man. He's with a bunch of talentless murderers who smell like baboons.
Given that whole situation, it's easy to see why the black population in South Africa might be vengeful towards the whites. It's also easy to see how many people still view it as being this racist, villainous nation. It's easy to see why people don't have that much sympathy for the white minority. But the truth is that there's at least two generations, the transitional generation and the post-apartheid generation, that really had nothing to do with any of this, were not brought up in it, and have lived beyond it. So these younger people are being held responsible for things that their ancestors did, and through no fault of their own, they didn't do anything, and yet they're being held responsible, held accountable, and villainized because of it. Now, this obviously isn't fair. This is the idea of original sin. And ever since Mandela went away, the situation in the South African government has been that they have tried to exploit this history, turn anger against the whites and exploit that for votes in a not dissimilar way to the way that right-wing parties in Europe and elsewhere try to fixate hatred on the other in order to bolster support for them via their racism. It's the same kind of situation. It's just the colours are inverted. That's really all it is. And of course, a lot of white people inherited or controlled a lot of land and so on. And there have been a lot of murders, but like a lot of things, this is mingled with class and wealth. It appears on a base surface level to be about race, but when you really dig down into it, like most of these conflicts, like racial issues in America and other countries, it comes down to class and wealth. The whites were a rich, comparatively, minority, which isn't to say that there aren't poor and destitute whites in South Africa as well, just as much as anyone else. But so the wealthy and whites became intermingled in people's minds. They became synonymous in the same way that poor and criminal has become synonymous with black in certain countries. Because, due to historical reasons, poverty and as a result criminality are more common in those communities. This is due to a lack of social mobility and so on. And South Africa hasn't had 100 years, 200 years to overcome these problems in the way that other nations have. It's hard to see that they're on their way. And so all this historical resentment and the perceived or real inequalities that exist haven't had time to smooth out or even out. And there's all this blame being placed. And so whites being considered to be rich or wealthy, and in many cases being richer or wealthier, have become targets for crime, and the criminals are, well, the population's 80% black, and the poor are disproportionately black. So the criminality is much more likely to come from that element. So it's difficult to pinpoint an actual racial element to things like the farm murders and the carjackings and the crimes, because really they could just as easily be targeting wealth, which isn't to say that there isn't racism and so on. But whichever way you cut it, there's no white genocide. Whites aren't being rounded up and killed, and yes, that's what genocide means. I know a lot of other crimes are conflated under the banner of genocide under the UN, but those acts aren't genocide. They're just considered to be part of the same problem. So the far right in other countries trying to exploit this to sell this conspiracy theory of white genocide, at least conspiracy theory in the current context, they're pushing it way too far. But that's not to say that there isn't racism, that there isn't unfairness, that there aren't problems, that the white minority is not in trouble, that the country is not in trouble. A real genuine problem is this compensation-free appropriation of white land. And you can make arguments about who was there first and whatever. The truth is, when the land was colonized, a lot of it wasn't being used. But people are presenting this as if it's the Zimbabwe situation, where people are being directly forced off their land. Well, we don't know yet. It might end up in that state. But according to the South African government, what they're doing with this appropriation is not taking land that's occupied, but taking land that isn't used, that just belongs to white people. Some of that does go back to apartheid, when certain areas were only allowed to be bought or settled by whites. So there are large amounts of land that are just held and nothing's being done with. So in theory, if they stick to their word, it should be the unused land that's being taken. Now this is still bad, you can see this as a violation of property rights and so on, but it's less bad than forcing farmers off the land that they work at gunpoint. We'll have to see how it all plays out, but while it's bad and we should be concerned, and it is racist, it's not as bad as people are making out. Now, white supremacist elements within South Africa and white supremacist elements elsewhere are exploiting this, but there is the possibility that this could turn into a situation like Zimbabwe, which was as close as you're going to get to a white genocide, I think. And we failed to intervene, we failed to speak up because of our perceptions here about racism. We seem unable to acknowledge that white people can be victims of racism. Particularly Americans, because they have their own context and they project that context onto the entire rest of the world. Now, while there is no white genocide, if there were, I think we'd have problems. Because a lot of commentators on the opposite side to the far right, the alt-left, if you will, the absurdly extreme left, are welcoming what is going on, are happy about the farm murders and so on. And it's absurd. Like I said, at least a generation, 2 generations, have nothing to do with anything that happened in the past, and yet, to some people's perception, they're being punished for it. Clearly that's not fair, and some of the things that some people are saying, you know, white radical left-wing people, that they're glad to see people being murdered and pushed off their land and their land taken from them. Yeah, that's worrying. That doesn't bode well if things do go south in South Africa, which they may very well do. We've seen it happen in Zimbabwe. South Africa might go the same way if this trend continues, and some of the rhetoric is particularly horrible.
He's never met a nice South African, and it's not bloody surprising, Nick, 'cause we're a bunch of ignorant love-nuts with no sense of humour.
So what to do? Well, the situation is bad. It's not completely horrible yet. We've all seen these problems coming up, the anti-white rhetoric, the appropriation of land. We'll see how that plays out. We've seen the whole situation in Zimbabwe, which acts as a warning of what could happen in South Africa. I'm sure we've all seen the videos of decolonization going on in South African universities and the disruption and rioting and violence that has gone on around them. So it's concerning. It's not white genocide, and be very wary of anyone on the right or the far right circulating memes. The supposed Joker smile girl, not true. It's an appropriated picture of a dog attack on a little girl. that's being used to kind of whip up anger and so on in others. It's not accurate. The thing is, there's no need to make this shit up, because there are horrible murders, but it's important to keep them in the proper frame, historical frame, economic frame, as well as the racial frame, to try and understand really what's going on. But the rhetoric seems to be gearing up. The racism towards whites seems to be gearing up. And there are issues which we shouldn't ignore just because the far right is exploiting them, and we should be concerned about the way that the far left is willing to give a pass to murderous racism just because the victims are white and come from a nation with a history of racism. So all I can really say is keep a weather eye on the situation. Be very wary of anything you read on it from anyone. Lauren Southern's interviews are good if you try to ignore the framing and just listen to what people are saying, and check everything. Be skeptical, be rational, check your sources, check what the government's actually saying about appropriation, watch how it unfolds. We'll see how things go, but I think our governments should be concerned and should apply diplomatic pressure to South Africa, because racism is bad, no matter who is doing it, to who, and that is a consistent value that we should all be able to agree on, but I know we don't. Anyway, yeah, that's about it. Horrible, horrible thing. Kif.
I'm a ninja. Yo, my life is like a video game. My main thing when I'm in the zone. One player, one life in the mark. Remember the dog.
Go ninja, go!
No fucking it down. I'm cutting down any one of my parts. Trying to fuck up my game with razor sharp political throw stars. Get my flows on horse. Wow, out of control. Ninja scope op de roof. Tough rounds met kok.